What is up, guys? Rick Hackus here, and today we are discussing the Underground DLC and whether or not it can save the Division. Now, I think most players, even Division players, would agree that the Division needs a little bit of saving. I think one of the best known stats is that the player base on Steam has dropped 93% since the game launched. Obviously, that's pretty darn bad. You see a drop in player bases for most games after they launch, but 93% is insane. I don't think it's as bad on the consoles, but still it's not going to be very good on the consoles either. So why does the Division need saving? Well, I'm not going to get too into it in this video. I've made separate videos talking about kind of my grievances with the Division, but essentially it boiled down to two things. Firstly, you had an unsubstantial endgame. When players would get into the Division, it was pretty fun leveling up, but once you got to the max level of 30, you didn't really have anything to do, especially when the game first came out. Since then, there's been definite improvements, but when the game first came out, literally when you got to the max level, you were expected to do the exact same things you were already doing and had already done, just on higher difficulties. And so a lot of players, that just didn't fly with them. Now, the second factor that really led to the kind of the mass exodus of the player base was that you had a pretty terrible and unrewarding loot system off launch. You simply had it so that it was a very, very hard chance to get what you want, and there was a ton of RNG, random number generators, built in to this loot. So when you got, an assault rifle that you were finally looking for, like finally you get the ACO, or finally you get a Vector or a gun that you actually want, or an armor piece that you actually need, and it has terrible perks, and so you delete it. And that happened all too often. Those two factors led to a lot of players becoming dissatisfied with the game and leaving it. So here we are talking about the new DLC that is just about to launch, the Underground DLC, and whether or not this DLC can revitalize and can save the Division. And I think there's a few very important factors that kind of go towards that the Underground might actually save the Division that actually, kind of funny enough, have nothing to do with the Underground DLC itself. Now, one of the main factors behind the Underground DLC potentially revitalizing the Division, again, it has nothing to do with the Underground DLC, what's actually in the DLC, but rather just has to do with the fact that a lot of players are going to be coming back and booting up the Division for the first time in a long time. I think a lot of players, I'm sure there's some of you watching this video, are in kind of the same boat I am, where, we really enjoyed the betas, we had a lot of fun, so we bought the gold edition of the game, which actually came with the Division and with the Season's Pass. And again, I'm sure there's a decent chunk of players who did this, so even though they may have left the Division, got bored with it, they already paid for the DLC. And so a lot of players, a good chunk of players, are going to be logging back onto the Division just to see what's going on, just to see kind of, have things changed? I already kind of bought this DLC, so let's try it out. And that is totally reasonable, and that is totally understandable. But this is great news for the Division and great news for the Underground DLC, because a lot of stuff has been fixed since the game came out that, again, has nothing to do with the Underground DLC. One of the biggest factors behind a lot of players leaving the game, as I've said, was an unrewarding loot system. But fairly recently, patch 1.2 came out that addressed a ton of the problems with the loot system, and I actually really liked patch 1.2. I think it did wonders for the loot system, and in fact, the Division's loot system now is finally at like an acceptable point for a loot system in a loot-based game, in my opinion. Finally, when you go out in the Division and you kill enemies at the higher tier difficulties, you actually get higher tier rewards. You get decent stuff for killing harder enemies. Imagine that, right? But finally, that's actually the case in the Division. So 1.2 really added, just did a wondrous thing for the loot system. And again, it really added some new content as well. There's been 2 incursions, which are kind of like a little bit harder, more normal levels that you can get better loot on. That's been added in free updates, and there's more features as well, such as the high value target missions, where you have these weekly high value targets where you collect intel for kind of going and doing these missions around the map, and then you can use that intel to buy a bounty against a high value target, go and hunt down that target, and killing those targets, the weekly ones at least, actually give you pretty good loot, like really good loot for a PvE activity. So again, a lot of people are going to be logging back onto the Division And the Division has definitely improved since launch. It's added new content, it's fixed the loot system by and large, so a lot of players are going to be, again, on for the first time since all of this stuff has changed. They haven't experienced what's been added and what's been changed, and they're, I think, in for a pleasant surprise. They're going to say, hey, look, the loot system is better. There's more stuff to do that's not even involved with the Underground DLC, and that is a huge step forward for the Division. If you can get players back on the Division and get them enjoying it, they have a much better chance to stay and play longer, and then if they're staying and playing longer, their friends that bought the game may hop back on again, and it really could end up revitalizing the game. Now again, that's not even talking about what's actually in the Underground DLC, and what's in the Underground DLC actually also has some chance to really revitalize the game. There's two main features of the Underground DLC that I want to touch on that can really help the game. The first one is the randomly generated dungeons. Now, of course, there's going to be more content than what I'm going to mention, just add in the Underground DLC, but this is one of the main features of this DLC, and it's essentially the fact that you can go to the staging area, and you can select the difficulty of these randomly generated dungeons, and when you go into these dungeons, it's these random rooms. There isn't a huge amount of information. It may just be 5 rooms that are just in a random order every time. I'm not exactly sure, but from what it looks like and from what I've seen, it does look like, again, you have these random layouts that are different every time you play it. That's great, and that's obviously awesome for replayability. Additionally, what also helps the replayability of this content is that you have the option to choose your difficulty, so you can scale the difficulty higher and higher, and you're going to get better rewards for doing so, but then you can also select these modifiers. So when you're about to select your dungeon, you select hard difficulty or normal difficulty, whatever, and then you can apply all these different modifiers. Now, some of the modifiers, I think an example of one of them is that if you tick it off, the enemies have a chance to shoot incendiary ammo at you, so things get a little bit harder. I think there's one where enemies have a little bit more health, and so on and so forth. And the more of these modifiers you tick off, the better your rewards get. And actually, there's a screen where someone was ticking off more and more modifiers, and it showed the rewards. Like for no modifiers, you get like 1 high-end weapon, but he ticked off a few modifiers, and now you get 1 high-end weapon and 1 gear set armor piece. And just kind of before I forget, there's a lot of players who left the Division before gear sets were even introduced. So those players coming back are going to get to experience a whole nother level of the loot system that wasn't currently there. So that's another great factor. In any event, so you add more modifiers, you get better rewards. So that is awesome for replayability. It's going to make each time you do it, depending on what modifiers you pick, depending on what difficulty, and the fact that it's a random layout, that's all going to contribute to make these dungeons really good for replayability and really something to do for PvE. Because before, and I think, when a lot of people were leaving, the only way to really realistically get decent loot in the Division was the Dark Zone. Like, let's be honest, the drop rates in the Dark Zone were very high, whereas grinding the daily, challenge mission just wasn't that fun. And so a lot of people, again, if they didn't enjoy the Dark Zone, which if you don't like the Dark Zone, totally reasonable. The Dark Zone definitely has its problems. But if you don't like the Dark Zone, back when the game first launched, you were kind of stuck. Because again, that was just by such a huge margin, the best way to get loot was just to grind the Dark Zone. So the players who didn't enjoy that just fell behind so much. So adding a replayable and rewarding piece of content via the dungeons into PvE, and this is helped by they added another rewarding piece of content, which is the high value loot targets that the high value targets I talked about earlier. That those two things are going to combine to make it so that the players who didn't really enjoy the Dark Zone are still going to have something to do and some decent loot to be able to earn for doing those things. Now, the last point I want to touch on that is being added with the Underground DLC, and all I'm going to say for this point, and I think, it's the last point, but definitely not in last place, frankly, in my opinion, the most important point. Like, this is just, I'm so glad they're doing this. This is why I'm kind of hyped for the Underground DLC, and basically no other reason. But the thing that they're adding with the Underground DLC that is really going to spice up the Division is new weapons. Thank God they are finally adding new weapons. New weapons are not added enough in video games, but yes, they're adding new weapons in the Underground DLC. And the best part is that they seem to be adding new weapons properly. Now, what I mean by properly is that the improper way to add new weapons is definitely if they would have added only named weapons. Now, the bad part about this is that if they would have added, an F2000 into the game, or they would have added the AA-12, and they actually are kind of doing this with the AA-12, unfortunately, but they add the AA-12 into the game, which is a fully automatic shotgun, obviously not in the Division right now, but they add that in and they make it a named weapon. What that does is it makes the perks that spawn with it the same perks every time. Now, this absolutely kills diversity in the game, because if the perks that, the Division developers think are good enough really aren't that good, no one uses the weapon. And no one goes for that weapon, and it's just not a huge part of the loot system. And we've seen that before. They added, the Hungry Hog was a named M60 that they recently added. I actually have one, and I never use it because, well, firstly, LMGs aren't great right now. But secondly, the perks that come with it just aren't that good. You have these, perks that were selected by the development team, and they aren't as good as some other LMGs that come with completely random perks. If you get a really good roll on another LMG, it's just going to be outright better. So, if they added all of these named weapons into the game, had these predetermined perks, if they weren't good, they would just fall into obscurity and not really help the loot system. But thankfully, they're adding weapons properly into the game. A great example of this is that with the Underground DLC, they're adding a new SMG, the PP-19, kind of like the Bison from, oh my goodness, Call of Duty Ghosts is actually where it's from, but the PP-19 was also from Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 and 3, I believe. But again, they're just adding a new SMG into the game. It has a little bit different stats in terms of the fire rate and damage and magazine size when compared to the other SMGs that are currently in the game, and thank goodness, this is the best part, it's just properly introduced as a new gun type into the game. So you can get completely random perks on it, you can get the God Roll PP-19, and you can get a Shit Roll PP-19, but the fact that you can get the God Roll is going to make it a desirable piece of loot. And it seems like they're doing it with several different weapons. They're adding the G36C Assault Rifle, among others, and these are all, again, properly added into the loot system as new weapons. That is fantastic. That's just gonna, the inner loot seeker of me, the guy who just bought Borderlands the pre-sequel, even though he already owns it for the Xbox One and the Xbox 360 via the Steam sale. I love looting, and the fact that they're adding new weapons, new things that I can get from my arsenal has already got me really excited for the Underground DLC, and it's a huge factor in saving the game. If they're properly adding new weapons, it revitalizes the loot system. If they didn't do this, and again, they just add some named weapons, the loot system would be pretty stale. People come back to the Division after a month, and they're still, or more, and they're still getting the same weapons they got before. That just wouldn't fly, right? And so this is the last factor, that they're properly adding new weapons to the loot system, that really helps the factor that the Underground DLC may indeed save the Division. Now, will it save the Division? I'm not entirely sure. Again, we're going to have to see the randomly generated dungeons. We're going to have to see if these new weapons are substantial enough to kind of revitalize the game. But all of these things I've laid out, it's looking good. To be quite honest, it looks really good. I know myself, I'm excited to get into the Underground DLC. I'm going to be playing the Division a lot more. And this is kind of the kickstart that this game needed. New weapons, new missions, new stuff to do. It just all really revitalizes the game and gives you a reason to play. Now, of course, if it's terrible, I'll be the first one to let you guys know that it's terrible. Trust me, I don't hold back. If I think something's shit, I'll tell you guys it's shit. So we'll see how it actually works out. But again, as I've outlined, things are looking up for the Division. That's good because I really wanted this game to succeed. I think it's a fun game at its core, and I think that some things were just done improperly, as I've kind of talked about in this video, and they're unfortunate because they didn't need to be done that way, and the Division could have still been a very fun game and not lost so much of its player base. Now, that's it for the video. Thanks for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed. Thanks especially if you've made it all the way to this point in the video. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please remember to help me out by simply rating and especially sharing this video. And if you want to see more Division content, including stuff from the Underground DLC, don't be afraid to slap that subscribe button. Now, if you want to get in touch with me and keep up to date with the latest channel activity, the best way is to follow me on Twitter at RickHackis. That's linked in the description down below, as is my Twitch channel, which you can also follow. Again, I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, have a good day.